Kelsey Huelsman. I'm a graduate student at the University of Virginia, and like Dave said, I've been at Blandy for a while. I've been here for 5 summers. This is my 6th summer. And like he also said, I completed my master's degree here, and when I decided to stay at UVA and earn a PhD, my advisor gave me 2 projects that I could work on kind of as options. One was using remote sensing to look at the Arctic in Alaska, and the other was using remote sensing and doing more field work in real life here at Blandy. And I felt invested in Blandy and familiar with Blandy. I had learned a ton about the plants here, and so I decided to stay here and do this project. So also, like Dave said, I'm interested in monitoring and understanding invasive plant species here at Blandy, but I'm using kind of a novel approach, which is remote sensing. So I think Kelsey kind of set up this idea of remote sensing at the very start of her explanation of her research, which is sort of, zooming out and looking at things from above. And that sort of is the concept of remote sensing, where you can look at things from above and make assessments of them. So you're probably kind of figuring out how a drone fits into this. So traditional approaches to looking at invasive plant species, going the furthest back would be sort of on the ground observations, walking around, seeing, is this plant here, what's growing where, and it's a super slow process. It's time intensive, and therefore it's money intensive, and you can sort of only cover, the one line that you walk down. And then as technology has progressed, it sort of has opened doors to other opportunities to be able to look at invasive plant species. And so that would be using satellite data. So zooming out, looking at the planet using satellites, we can sort of look at invasive plants, but satellite data tends to be really coarse resolution. Satellites are super far away, right? So the pixels in the images are not very small. It would be like a lot of tree canopies, and that means that the pixels aren't really a whole canopy. It's like a whole collection, a whole forest that you're looking at. And so that doesn't really help us either to get a good feel for like where invasive plant species are. So this is where the drone comes in. My advisors, Howard Epstein and Shi Yang, teamed up with Rod Walker from the Blue Ridge PRISM, which is the Program for Regional Invasive Species Management. I don't know if any of you know Rod Walker. I feel like everyone knows Rod Walker. And so they were thinking, it would be really cool if we could use a drone to try to get a feel for where invasive plant species are in the landscape. Okay, and so at this point, I will show you the drone. I think it's pretty impressive because when you think about a drone, you're probably not thinking about something like this. It's also really heavy. So this is a hexacopter. It has 6 little rotors, and every time I go out in the field, I set this thing up, clip the little rotors in. They all have their little socks that they wear. So this is actually, what the drone looks like when it's fully spread out. It's pretty gigantic. And I program it to go on a set flight over multiple fields here at Blandy. The other cool thing to note is these little gadgets are antenna, so that the drone kind of understands where it is in space. So it understands how high up the ground it is, how high up above the ground it is. It understands where it is, latitude and longitude wise, and it flies on a set path. And then the other thing to note is, hanging from underneath of this little thing that's moving around, is an imager. So I'm calling it an imager and not a camera, because it's kind of like a fancy camera. Typical cameras, show you light and dark and a balance of colors. This imager can not only see visible light coming off of plants, but it can also see near infrared radiation. So it sees more than what we see when we look at plants. It sees, characteristics that we can't see that are sort of associated with leaf structure and canopy structure. And so the idea here is that because this imager can see so much, it sees colors, it sees near infrared, and it sees it in great detail, the idea is that this can differentiate species and allow us to tell them apart. So the other reasons that we would use a drone is we can fly at different points in the growing season. So maybe certain plant species are more detectable early in the growing season. Maybe they're more detectable in the middle of the growing season or even later in the growing season. I have found it seems like early to mid growing season has tended to be better. Later in the growing season, things get kind of willy-nilly, and there's so much variability that everything is too variable to tell things apart. And so I guess at this point I should also mention the species that I care about. You're probably wondering which species I'm caring about. So I would say the hottest topic among most people is Ailanthus or Tree of Heaven. People are invested in that specifically because of the spotted lanternfly and the potential. I guess it's here at Blandy. Oh, yeah. It's not yet down to Central Virginia and Richmond, at least that I know of. But it's getting there, I'm assuming.
I'm sure.
Yeah. So that sort of is a hot topic that everyone seems to care about. And then there's two other plants that I care about that are really prevalent here at Blandy, one of which is an invasive shrub, autumn olive, which is also really prevalent across Virginia, and is also a species that Rod Walker from Prism cared about. And then there's one species that I kind of threw at everybody that I don't know that people care that much about outside of Blandy, which is buckthorn, which is all over here at Blandy. And some of my collaborators have studied buckthorn, and it kind of seems like it is stalling the succession and incoming tree species. It sort of just like stops everything from progressing any further. So I thought buckthorn's a super interesting species to look at too. So those are the three species that I'm most concerned about looking at. And so some of the questions that I'm answering in my research are, one, because this drone flies so close to the ground, it's not like right above the ground, but compared to a satellite, it flies really close to the ground. And because of that, the size of the pixels in the images is about leaf-sized, which means we're seeing a ton of detail in these canopies. And so one of the questions that I have is, how variable is what we see within a single canopy? And how variable is what we see among canopies within the same species? And does that impact our ability to detect these invasive plants? And also, what does that variability tell us about sort of the journey through the growing season of all of these plants? And then I think the foundational question of my research is, when and how do we detect these plant species? And once I've figured out when and how we can detect these plant species, my goal is to scale up from these individual fields where I've been collecting data. So I pretty much have one field where I'm testing out the capacity to differentiate and detect these plant species. And once I sort of have that down pat, I can scale that up to data that's collected really broadly on the landscape scale, thanks to the National Ecological Observatory Network that also has a field station here at Blandy. So they've collected images with a very similar imager over a lot of a broader space, sort of like a few miles, so that I can get a feel for not only where are the plants, in these fields that I'm focused on at Blandy, but also where are these plants in the broader landscape that includes Blandy, but also the surrounding areas. And then the last question that I'll sort of answer, given the ability to use remote sensing and get kind of a spatial map of where these things are, is the impact that these invasive plants have on community characteristics. And one of the fun things that you can do with these detailed data that these fancy imagers collect is it can sort of serve as a proxy for characteristics like leaf nutrients or productivity. So it's really interesting what we can do with remote sensing. And so not only am I contributing to research on invasive plant species and where they are, but I think I'm also contributing to the ecological understanding of where these are using a really novel and, in my opinion, fun approach. So yeah, that's what I do here. And that, if you've ever been out here and seen me flying the drone, pretty much every time, like Kelsey, when she's in the field, people coming up and being like, "What are you doing?" Without fail, people are like, "What is that? What are you doing?" So it's always fun to get to talk to folks about it.
How high up does it go? Does it go above the tree level?
Yes, yeah. So because I'm collecting images kind of tree canopies, I always have it fly about 50 meters above the ground. So, and with that height, that's what kind of gives the spatial resolution of like a leaf-sized pixels. Yeah, so it's like really fine resolution, very detailed.